We are at Cranfield School of Management in the Management Research Institute with Dr. Richard Wilding, who is Professor of Supply Chain Risk Management. Now, Richard is one of the leading supply chain management specialists in Europe today, and we're going to be talking about the importance of time in the supply chain. Now, why is it so important to understand about time in the supply chain?
The issue of time is that time now is the most important dimension we can really understand. The reason for this is it's like the x-axis on every graph we produce. When I understand the time dimension of the supply chain, I can then start actually plotting cost against time, demand against time, inventory against time, process against time. In other words, any key variable can actually be plotted against time. Now, what's interesting is when we understand time, that starts to gain us transparency. And when we have transparency, it builds trust. So one of the things that I often talk about are the 3 T's of highly effective supply chains: time, transparency and trust. But time is, if you like, the place you need to go for first, because getting that one sorted then starts to really release, if you like, the power of supply chain management within an organisation.
Okay, why not look straight at costs?
The problem with looking straight at costs is that if you think about it, cost is a bit of a strange parameter to try and measure. Because as soon as you start trying to compare costs in different environments or different places across the world, people have different ways of measuring costs, different ways of allocating overheads and so on and so forth. But the good news about time is that 1 second is 1 second wherever you go in the world. Now, sometimes people think that isn't quite the case, but that is the case. 1 second is 1 second wherever you go. So if you start to understand, say, the time it takes you to do a particular process within the supply chain, you can then benchmark that process anywhere in the world. So therefore, rather than saying, well, how much does it cost for me to do it in the UK compared with Brazil, you can start saying, well, how long does it take me to do that particular process? If we then find out that people in Brazil do it in half the time, we can go and say, well, why are they doing it in half the time? Might be they've got twice as many people. But what we need to be able to understand is we need to understand the time dimension first. When we understand time, then you can start allocating costs to the time, right? And often we have a debate about what's value-adding time, time which the customer is effectively willing to pay for, and also time which is non-value-adding time. And when you actually look at all the analysis, generally we find that only around about 5% of a typical lead time to a customer is value-adding time. In other words, the time where you're processing it or doing something with it that the customer's willing to pay for.
Okay, but how can people start to understand time in the supply chain?
Well, one of the simplest ways people can start to understand time in the supply chain is using a simple technique called time-based process mapping. What this enables you to do is to actually map out a process with respect to time. Traditional process mapping, generally what that does is it looks at what are the key operational stages. You know, so it might be Jane fills in the order in the sales office, then Mike inputs it onto the computer. But what we're really interested in is all the time in between. So it might be Jane fills the order in the sales office, it then goes into her in tray where it sits for half a day before she sort of empties it out and takes it to somebody else's tray or in tray. And that's where a lot of time gets lost in the processes. Even on computer systems, information will be input onto the computer, but it might actually not be made live maybe till the end of the week or the end of the day. So then, you know, you think you're doing something instantly, but a whole day has gone by before anybody can do anything with that information. So by using time-based process mapping, which is actually a very simple Gantt charting approach, you can start to map this. And what's nice about that is when people start doing time-based process mapping, they start to understand the process they're part of, which then links to my final T, which is T-shaped people. People who understand the process that they are part of, so you're like the letter T effectively, but they still have that functional specialism. And by people actually going out and understanding how time operates across the supply chain, all of a sudden an awareness is created within the organisation of what processes are going on, and therefore we're able to manage them far more effectively.
Richard, thanks very much for your time today.
It's been a pleasure.